So let's start. What value does Judaism place on logic? It's interesting. I think it's Rashi, or is it Rashi? I forget who brings it on the Torah when we talk about. Actually, let's have a look over here. That's there, Pasha Bereshit here. That when we talk about Tselem Elokim, somebody brings the ability to think with Chochmah, with Seichel, and so on. Rishonim generally place quite a high value on logic. That's the general. Obviously, there's a logic in studying Gemara. Gemara, amongst other different systems of thought used, including the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 derivation techniques to derive from verse in the Torah to the law. But there's also logic, there's also svara, right? That's the Ramchal has a sefer on logic. There's svarim written on logic. So, but generally speaking, when it comes to Emunah as well, to faith in God, most, not all, no, I shouldn't say that, there's a split. In the Rishonim, we do find a strong push. Saadia Gaon talks about logic in the beginning of the Emunah Sedeos. Chovos HaLevavos uses a lot of logic in the shiur Emunah to demonstrate the existence of God. So does Saadia Gaon. The Rambam talks about it. The Rambam thinks studying logic is a prerequisite to entering the paradise, to go into the deeper areas of discovering God. You have the Rashba, who has a certain skepticism, if you like, to some degree about the validity of philosophical approach in general. Now, philosophy in those days was not just logic. Even today, philosophy is not just logic. Philosophy in those days was really the same word for science, the attempt of science, speculative science, physics, metaphysics, a whole bunch of things thrown together. So the Rashba is worried where it can lead to, right? And then you've got the issues that come up in more recent times where there's been more of a swing to skepticism about philosophical argument and chakira, more in favor of Emunah peshutah, of direct connection to God, right? People translate Emunah peshutah as blind faith. No, neither the word Emunah nor peshutah mean blind. Peshutah means straightforward, simple, direct. So that's it. So now the question becomes, so when we say what does Judaism say, we've got lots of different thinkers within the Torah framework about this. The Shloah HaKadosh, so that's already early Acharonim, early of the later commentaries, which roughly the last 500 years. He brings both. In the Hishar Osius, he has a whole section where he goes through something for every letter of the alphabet, and Aleph is Emunah, and he talks about that. He talks about the importance of learning the Chovos HaLevavos and its arguments, and he talks about the importance of cultivating a natural spiritual connection to God. Now, you've asked a different question, though, which is very important, which is a part B of this, because I'll come back to part A soon in Yetzer Hashem. But part B, which is how can we really rely on logic, since at the end of the day, humans are biased. And this is very important because every logical argument is only as strong as its premises and deduction rules. That's it. So you can actually challenge any argument anyone will make for anything as long as you're willing to challenge premises. All an argument can show you is what price you have to pay to deny something. For example, if I want to claim none of you exist, well, my eyes see you, assuming I'm not going to lie about that. So I could start to say, well, yeah, but I don't trust my eyes, or I don't trust my memory, or I don't trust this, or I don't trust that, bless you. But then you'll point out to me, I do it in every other context, right? So you start to point out that I'm being very inconsistent, but if I said maybe this is all a big simulation, okay, maybe it is. But then if I want to say, and therefore, when you tell me I've got to work somewhere or do something or keep a law or anything, I don't need to listen because it could just be a big simulation. And then you catch me tomorrow looking right and left before I cross the street and you go, but it could be a great simulation. I go, no, but this is the best I can do. I've got to take it as if it's real. And then you go, well, you see? So philosophical arguments can show you where you're being intellectually inconsistent. They can show you, for example, somebody wants to say the earth is flat. So you're going to start saying, 1 second, all the scientists think it's round. There's pictures that seem to show it's round. There's globes everywhere. You start so once you start challenging the premises, you'll sooner or later reach the conclusion that there is a gigantic earth-wide conspiracy of almost everybody or at least anybody who produces globes and maps and physics textbooks and the entire scientific community and people who are allegedly sending satellites to space and. You'd have to have this gigantic conspiracy, and people are planning flight paths for airlines, and like the whole thing just has to be some crazy conspiracy. So if you're willing to believe that, fine. I can't disprove you. What my argument can do is show what the intellectual price is. Now, when you get to very big questions like whether God exists, either religion or politics or things that are very deep, and people will pay high intellectual prices, partly because they'll justify by saying, yeah, but let's say the idea of God is so crazy, you need such overwhelming evidence. I don't care if you push me to a position where I'm starting to sound a bit irrational, but it's less irrational than that, right? But ultimately, we're putting weight onto certain things. And therefore, that's where the human biases can start to play significant roles. If I'm very strongly biased to believe something's true or believe it's false, I might be willing to pay quite a high intellectual price in order to avoid pushing one way or the other. That doesn't mean there isn't a huge value to logic. See, I'll tell you something else. If you don't use logic, you're actually much more susceptible to being pushed in bias. And in fact, without logic, we almost have no other tool. The reason's as follows. Somebody will say something like, when so-and-so speaks to us, it sounds so convincing and so compelling. What would it be like, but when I go online and I hear somebody else on the other side, they sound so convincing and so compelling. And when you read such and such a book, they sound so convincing and so compelling. What's going on? It's that people haven't learned to use logic, okay? What do I mean by that? I mean, if you read a book or listen to a speaker who sounds so convincing, so compelling, one of the best exercises you can do, in my opinion, is try to write out in your own words the core logical argument. What were the premises? What's the conclusion? Why? Because humans don't just present logical arguments, they do it with rhetoric. There are masters of rhetoric out there in the world. Some of the leading intellectual atheists are just absolute brilliant with rhetoric. Christopher Hitchens, when he was alive, was the master. He was a wordsmith, and not because he's a tricker, not because he's dishonest. Just the language, when you use a word to designate something, you can pick a whole bunch of different words, and they all have a different picture they bring up. So, for example, if you're anti-circumcision, if you're pro it, you might describe circumcision as a very minor procedure or surgery. Not even a surgery, but it's a minor procedure, virtually painless, doesn't. But if you're anti, you'll call it genital mutilation. Because the word mutilation has the connotation of hacking a limb off a person, irreversibly, right? So, but you are removing a piece of skin irreversibly, right? So you start to realize the power of language. Do you talk about a celestial dictator instead of God? You see that language produces emotions and pictures. And that's why when people are anti-Israel want to describe war, they want to use the word genocide because they want to develop an emotional, right, apartheid, right? It's very important for people to throw language and words at you that generate feelings. And people who are skilled at doing this don't do it consciously. They don't. Tones and emotions also exhibit confidence. People who sound confident are compelling, and the reason is the human being has learned to trust people. We haven't learned, that's a very important part of our programming. The reason that we can go through life and not have to relearn everything that everybody's learned is because we trust people. We trust people of authority. We trust the wisdom of the masses. And most of the time that serves for the good. But often in these arguments where somebody sounds very confident and asserts that everyone intelligent agrees with them, and when your views are mocked, you lose the capacity to properly evaluate what's going on. The more unpopular someone's view is, the more they'll naturally say, well, maybe I'm wrong. And this is proven many times in experiments and social thought conformity in the 1970s. So the healthiest thing to do when you want to figure out something yourself is use logic. And logic will say, what premise has he said? What is he claiming is true? What's he claiming follows from that which is true? Almost every argument goes like this. If I want to conclude B, I will first tell you A is true, and then I'll tell you A implies B. And if you want to know why A is true, I'll give you another bunch of arguments, because C is true and C implies A. And if I want to know why does A imply B, because something else is true and that implies this. That's how the structure of all arguments work. And you can then trace them and see, well, what would the counter arguments be? You see, now you've freed the argument from its rhetoric, from its confidence, from the adjectives that are being used, from the denotation versus connotation, from all of this, and you're free to study the argument itself. And then if you want to really make sure you're not biased, then what you do is you trick your brain and you say, if I was paid $1 million to find the best counter-argument, what would I find? It usually works. After a few minutes of thinking, you find a good argument, good counter-argument, and you go back and forth until you realize this is the point that now everything rests on, or these three things are the real differences. Now, how do I work out which one is true? So you do a huge amount of the work that way. So therefore, logic is an extremely important tool if we're ever going to get into any of this kind of stuff. I'll give you an example. You brought the example of moral. What's the moral argument for the existence of God, and what does it or doesn't it prove? Okay, so typically a moral argument for the existence of God will say, premise one, we all agree there's an absolute truth, right? That's what the premise will say. Premise two is, if there is an absolute truth, the source of that truth has to come from something higher than nature. It has to be God, right? Now, how do you know? What makes you think that we all agree that morality is absolutely true? Lots of people on planet Earth claim morality is not absolutely true, or it's relative truth. And we'll start to bring examples like, well, most people will agree that whether killing somebody or raping somebody or committing a genocide or anything is absolutely wrong. They'll have their favorite topic on that list. Does not depend on human opinion. Right? It's wrong. More than that, claiming that human opinions can be wrong means that there's a standard higher than human evidence. Okay, so what's the argument? The argument is there are cases and examples, everybody has cases and examples, where they will claim something is wrong no matter what human opinion is. The conclusion of that is they're claiming it's absolutely wrong. Does that follow? Do you think that works, right? If you think that works, well then why does that give it the conclusion that God exists? Right? So you'll say something like, because if the highest authority was, if morality was just human feelings and opinions, then you couldn't evaluate them as right or wrong. Just like taste. You can't say a taste is wrong. Okay, maybe, and that's where you'll go down and you'll start trying to push down that sort of line. You're going to come up with which you can actually trace the premises and the conclusions step by step, and they'll say, well, okay, but why does it have to be God? Maybe it's something else. Well, let's see. It's higher than, you're claiming it's higher than humanity. You claim it's higher than society because you claim a whole society can be immoral. That will be the argument. If a whole society can be immoral, then morality has to come from outside of society. You'll claim that nature can lead to drives that are immoral, so it's coming from outside nature. You're going to make these claims, then you're going to conclude that morality is something higher than, that we all believe in morality, and morality is something that is that can supersede and judge individuals, societies, even global opinion and nature, and therefore it's a belief in something that is higher than society, humanity, and nature. That's actually as far as the argument can get. So now a skeptic will say, okay, I hear that. Let's suppose they agree with all your premises and the logic makes sense. They may try and find alternatives to God that are higher than all of that, or they may turn to you and say, well, I agree with you that we all think that way, but that doesn't mean it's true. You see? So they'll say, you've convinced me, maybe, that, but look, there's a few routes, but people can say, no, I don't believe in what you say. I don't believe things are right or wrong, absolutely. You can usually prove to somebody they do. You'll just catch them on a moment they're not looking. So you'll meet a real liberal, and a real liberal will tell you, I don't believe there's any right or wrong. It's all relative. Every culture, no culture's better, no culture's worse. And then you'll go, oh, so you think what Israel's doing in Gaza is absolutely fine? Oh, no, that's terrible. That's, well, I thought you said it's all relative. It's relative, let them, So you'll usually catch people able to point out that they themselves do feel there's absolute right or wrong. But now someone could turn to you and go, okay, I do feel it's absolute right or wrong, but I don't think my feelings are right. Right? That's where usually you'll find people start to push in this argument. Is that what you've found, or you've found elsewhere? So what you're then pushing them to is, okay, so what we're saying is all the judgments you make, every time you make the judgment and say, Israel's in the wrong, or conservatives are wrong, or banning abortion is evil, or whatever argument it is that will get them agitated, you are at that moment articulate something that only makes sense if there's something higher than nature, society, and so on. And at that moment, you are living in a worldview inconsistent if it doesn't include God, or something higher than nature, society, and so on. So every time you feel that passion, realize at that moment you are being intellectually inconsistent if you don't at that moment, in that passionate moment, have a worldview that incorporates something higher than all that.
makes sense to me, but that doesn't mean it's the truth.
Right.
And so what do you do when you run into that final line of people refuse to take their intellectual capacity as a means to reach legitimate conclusions?
No, so what you've got to ask is, on what premises are they making that, and is that inconsistent? Your best hope when you're convincing anybody in an argument is to show them the position is inconsistent, that you wouldn't apply elsewhere. Elsewhere it would seem ridiculous. And that's why I gave those examples. When somebody says, let's say in an American political debate, that being pro-abortion or anti-abortion is evil, right, which, on a typical, the world that usually says morality is relative is usually in the liberal world, and there's usually plenty of things. Racism is evil, right? They'll usually go for something like that. They'll usually find Israel's evil, right? Or the West is evil, or whatever it may be. Anyone who denies whatever it is evil. So, systemic racism. So, at the moment they're making, to even be able to make that claim, you have to have a worldview that includes something higher than humanity, society, because you're criticizing whole societies, possibly human nature. So you are the force with which, the only sense in which your sentence makes sense, and the only sense in which should even take you remotely seriously, is if there is something higher. Now, right now, when you're having this argument, you might decide there's nothing higher, and therefore, for the sake of this argument, racist people are as morally valuable or unvaluable as appropriate or inappropriate as anti-racist people. Pro-abortion, anti-abortion is just a matter of flavor. But once you get into those arguments, you can actually try and say something. At that moment, realize you make no sense unless you're appealing to something higher. That's probably a good place to leave the argument. Let people think about that. If you try and force people too far, all they'll just do is start denying premises. But in terms of the logic, what you've demonstrated is to the extent to which we believe one, we implicitly believe the other. We can deny them both, or we can admit them both, but they're tied to one another. And therefore, now go and just evaluate for yourself whether in your passionate moments you really think you're telling the truth, or whether you just think you're being tricked. And if you think you're being tricked over time, you'll find your passions will dissolve, as they do with everything else that we realize we're being tricked over, right? But if you find your passion, they'll say, yes, it's my evolutionary programming and I just can't help it. Okay, fine, so just don't take yourself too seriously. And realize in your calm moments that when you get passionate about this stuff, this is just your inner raptor, your bird brain, or a reptile brain, or whatever, going completely ballistic over a complete hallucination. And just, don't worry about it too much. Right? So that's what that argument will achieve. It doesn't usually go, it gets the person to that dilemma. That's, I think, the best it can do, which is actually quite a good place to go. And this is a point you can often make with people, is that humans are often inconsistent. One part of our brain thinks about an issue this way, but other parts of our brain think about it differently. And to draw consistency will come with prices. And if you really want to be able to passionately declare, bless you, that so-and-so Republican politician is a racist and a this and a that, and assume there's any moral force to anything you're saying, at that point you're bringing, if not God, then something above nature, society, and so on into the picture. Now, your question, if a person wants to believe something, is that good or bad? So the search, it's an interesting one. Normally what you'd say is, no, that's just a bunch of biases. The search for meaning, on the other hand, and this really comes out a little bit in Rabbi Chanan and in the Chazon Ish when they talk about the Emunah and natural bias. Rabbi Chanan has this famous question, if Emunah is a mitzvah, having or more than Emunah, the Rambam says you have to have the Yidiyas Hashem, you meant to really know God exists. How can you instruct a 13-year-old boy to really know something about which is enormous philosophical debate? And in the end, he says something which you could dismiss at first, which is, no, if a person didn't have biases that all conclude God exists, then you go, go and I'll say that to the intellectual atheist or the person struggling with them. But there is something to that, don't need my endorsement, is that when you find people, it's like people say, I can't believe in God, I just wish I could because then I'd believe in an afterlife. Like, I'm biased to believe in God, I just can't bring myself to. There's a truth to that. There is a certain intellectual or emotional benefit to believing in God, but there's at least an equal counterweight to not believing in God, which is typically, when people talk about belief in God, they really mean belief in a religion, and typically religion involves imposition on a lot of other instincts we have. The most common instinct that gets in the way of people's desires that they wish religion would get out of the way for, usually sexual, but there can be other areas of ethics as well. It can be anything from honesty and integrity to any mitzvah in the Torah people find hard, or in whatever religion they're talking about. And there'll always be plenty of them. There is always a tax that comes with it. And so you've got biases in all directions. Humans have biases in all directions, and the biases do make us want to push counter arguments, even if they seem very weak otherwise or frail, or arguments for. But the difference, therefore, it's very interesting, is that the more superficial we are, the more the bias is against belief in God. The deeper we are, the more the bias is pro-God. So in some sense, you could argue that there is a free will choice between, am I trying to be a superficial, animalistic, self-centered being, in which case my bias will move against God, or am I trying to be a deep, other-centric, world-centric being, in which case my bias will actually shift towards God. And interestingly enough, I think a average human being can hear that they would much rather be the deeper self. So it becomes an interesting observation that the deeper self pulls us more in the direction of God. And that by itself is not an argument for God's existence, but it does show that where the biases lie and which self we want to be. This one draws us more to God, and this one pulls us more away. And that, by the way, is the root of Emunah peshutah, because at the metaphysical level, what we'd say is this is the animal and this is the soul. And the soul's always seeking God, and the animal's always trying to run away from God. And we choose whether we're an animal, in which case we'll deploy our brain to find as many brilliant arguments. Our brain can be like a lawyer, and this goes back to the bias question. Our brain can be a lawyer to find as many arguments for any position, and no matter how absurd it is. The question is, therefore, how do we reduce our biases? So we can check biases where they lie by using logic. But we also anyway want to work on ourselves to be less animalistic. A side benefit of which is we will pull away the bias against God. We might actually tap into the part of us that's more naturally connected to, or even wants to believe in God, right? But we should, and that's the root. The root of Emunah peshutah is the more we become a soul and not a body, the more we just become naturally aware of God. That's really, so you could look at it as a bias, you could look at it as an Emunah peshutah. But of the two, you'd much rather be in the deeper place than the superficial place anyway, right? But logic helps when we're more in between, and we're aware of all the biases, but we're able to use reason at that point. Once we can use reason at that point, then it can usually be quite compelling and quite convincing. I think the arguments for the existence of God are extremely compelling. Yeah. If you want, you can see my debate with A.C. Grayling, who was like one of the real big philosophers of atheism. Excellent with words, very big rhetorician, but you can make up your own mind, but I think little me was nowhere near as academically qualified as him, etc. I think the general consensus was, you might disagree, that the argument for God came out much stronger than the argument against. That's not because I'm more brilliant. He's much more brilliant than I am, a much better debater than me. It's just, it is objectively a much stronger argument to give, the arguments for the existence of God, than the ones against. That's my opinion. You check that out, again, don't listen to the rhetoric of either of us. Try and write the arguments down and see what's going on. But you can do that yourself whenever you research this topic or any other. Okay, let me move to the other questions. That was about 3 or 4 of the questions that we started with, but you have another question different to the other ones? Go on, yeah.
No, I'm just following up.
Following up? Okay, great, go for a follow-up, yeah.
More of like, once you've decided there is something higher than you, how do you know if there is something to follow, if there's any actual systemized or organized...
Okay, that's a very important, yes.
What that higher thing wants of us, or maybe doesn't want, or... Yeah, I'm just curious.
Excellent, that's very good. So yes, we've been talking about the existence of God till now, but of course, even if you could be convinced there's a creator of this universe or some higher whatever, that doesn't get you to the Torah. It doesn't get you to Judaism. For that, you need a different set of arguments. And the sorts of arguments you'll be looking at for the question of did God write a Torah are like questions of are biblical prophecies that have come true sufficient to demonstrate non-human authorship. Those would be the sorts of arguments you want to look for. What are the criteria we'd use? What sort of things could a human author have guessed? How can we quantify whether something did or didn't come true? Are there counterexamples? Those are the sorts of things you want to do. I think any research into that's taken seriously I believe will lead to the conclusion that there's no real room for doubt in the end that this thing is, or at least I think a reasonably open-minded person would end up concluding that the text of the Torah itself is clearly a divine text. But there's plenty of arguments to be had along that sort of journey. It's those sorts of arguments we're going to wanting to be turning to, rather than abstract, pure first cause type arguments or whatever, which would get you to God. But it's a different set of arguments. If you're interested, maybe another time, if we have enough time from the start of a Q&A, we can actually dedicate a session to that. They have some of the stuff in the Discovery Seminar. The 7 ones of Jewish history, I think, it needs a bit of augmenting on how there can't be late authorship, and maybe we'll come back to some of the Bible criticism stuff here. You need a bit of that kind of augmentation. But I think together it produces a very, very compelling case for divine authorship of Torah. But you'd have to decide that for yourself. That's the sort of argument you'd want to go with the text, the religious text. If somebody wants to claim that Judaism is true, they're going to have a good reason to believe Hashem wrote the Torah. the Torah is a real divine text and not a human text. I'm talking about Orthodox Judaism. Okay, now there were other questions at the beginning. There was a question about what I said on Friday night about Bible criticism, a recap of that. So very roughly what I explained there is that standard biblical criticism, or early biblical criticism, was very focused. Is the room very hot? Could be because I opened it, said it's closed. No, only if you are. I might be animated because I'm talking in front. I don't mind. If people are hot, then then feel free to turn on the AC. If you're not hot, leave it exactly as it is. Okay, so biblical criticism is it's a set of ideas. It's not one idea, but it's a set of methods that come with a set of ideas, looking at the divine text and trying to figure out authorship, assuming human authorship. So that's already an issue. It assumes human authorship, but there's quite sophisticated methods. And there's many, many different schools of biblical criticism. The most famous, and historically was the most dominant, probably still the largest single school today, was called the documentary hypothesis, that believed that the Torah text we have today is fundamentally from at least 4 primary source materials that have been redacted together. And the early work split it into 2. We're talking Ausdruck, we're talking like before Julius Wellhausen, who wasn't the inventor of the concept of the 4 authors, but really wrote a very compelling attempt to try to see the evolution of ancient Israelite thought. That was his idea. And so the 4 authors were the J and the E author, or the 4 early texts. J is the really Yud, Y is the name, 4-letter name Hashem, and E is Elohim. Right? And the idea was very, very early on, the observation that there's 2 names are the most dominant names of God in the Torah. They often appear separate from one another, and sometimes you get stories that appear to be repeated where one uses one name and one uses the other, especially near the beginning in Bereshis and Noach, actually, in the first 11 chapters of Torah. And so the hypothesis emerged that there must have been, or very likely were, different documents, one that used one name of God, one used the other. One was Northern Kingdom, that was a standard hypothesis from Wellhausen onwards. One was Southern Kingdom, and they got merged together when the Northern Kingdom collapsed, or something like that. That was the kind of model that was going on. There's also the P hypothesis, which is that all the stuff to do with priestly things is a different author, and the D, which is the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, because that's a different style since it's Moshe Rabbeinu talking, but that was actually really a different author. These are and they were redacted together. Often they think Ezra's the redactor. That's kind of the standard basis of mainstream biblical criticism, documentary hypothesis. And if you ever study it, you'll see there's many, 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 many versions of these. Some have a lot more authors, and then you have rival theories that don't go for this. They have more fragmentary hypothesis. There were thousands of fragments that were amalgamated into the text, or kind of like a rolling snowball type of, like this text was very minimal and added piece on. There's lots of different approaches. But this is probably still the single, of all it may not be any more the overwhelming dominant one, but it's still very likely the largest or one of the largest. And what I was pointing out on Friday night is there's many, many issues with this hypothesis, including some very important computer research, certainly on the parts to do with anything to do with J and E. I would say, but again, don't take my word for it, if you want I can give you some source material, that as far as the best scientific evidence is concerned, you would argue the J and the E split is refuted. You could still make cases for other things. Really because others objectively there is an objectively different writing style of Devarim. We've known that forever. Anyone who reads the Torah can know that. So it's very straightforward. But the obvious explanation for it is it's Moshe's speeches. The rest of the Torah is very little of Moshe's speeches. It's mainly being narrated in the third person. It claims, effectively implies it's by God dictating to Moshe. When God then tells Moshe to write out his own speeches that he gave, his language will be different. So that's our hypothesis. A critic will say, no, it's just a different human author, right? And then we also notice, you can notice this yourself again, whenever we talk about the Mishkan, we use a different set of vocabulary. So science will pick it up. But the J and the E, which for decades, they were like, but I can notice certain words appear whenever we use Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and certain words appear when we use Elohim, or certain places appear here and not there. That's actually scientifically false, or at least it's within the realm of random. But what I was making the point was, even without getting into computer research, even without getting into that, which has shown that it's the same author, or there's no way to distinguish those authors, even if you didn't have computer research. Actually, if you study the narrative of the Torah, it's easy to miss the fact that the names of God is central to the narrative. It's not, we happen to use two different names of God. It's not even, which is also true, that the four-letter name typically expresses the midah of mercy, and the name Elokim, din, strict justice, which is true. But it's much more profound than that. If you look at the usage, so, and now I'll give an elaborate version of what I said on Friday night, okay? The name Elokim, as a name of God, that word has secular usage. The four-letter name never does. The word Elohim can mean anything or anyone with power who makes order, right? Judges are called Elohim. Rulers are called Elohim. Angels are called Elohim. Things people worship are called Elohim. You can say the whole of nature is called, everything is Elohim. Elohim is angels, anything that has power. Right? The Kuzari points out Hateva, the entirety of nature, is also the gematria of the word, has the same numerical weight as the word Elohim. So laws, law, order. When does it become a name? And typically it takes plural adjectives and verbs because it's plural, it's forces, laws, orders, rulers. When does it become a name of God? When we look at the source of all power. We look to the root of all power, order, and structure, and we say there's a first, then the name becomes a divine name, and then it typically even though it's written like a plural word, actually it's treated singular, and it takes singular verbs and adjectives and so on. And then we don't even pronounce it in non-religious contexts. We call it Elokim. So it really means the root of all forces, power, and order in the world. But interestingly enough, it means that we start by observing things in the world, deducing that it's got law, order, and not random, and then rooting all of that back to a creator, which is the typical way humans philosophically think about things. The four-letter name of God is different. It has no secular usage. It is not directly revealed in the world. Maybe you could figure out that the world must have a creator or something, but it even if you try to give any etymological root, it's really an integration of three Hebrew words: Haya, was, Hova, is, and Yehia, will be, all put together. So it's like timelessness, beyond space and time, deeper than the name Elohim. And that's why we say the outer one is justice and laws in the world, but the inner one is love and mercy way beyond that. It's like kind of the long arc of history rather than what you see. So in the creation chapter, once you have that principle set up, in the creation chapter, when all we're talking about is laying out of the laws of the universe, which name of God are we going to use? Which is the one that's to do with all the laws? Elokim. And in fact, you will consistently find that in the creation chapter, there's only one name of God, Elokim. The name Hashem never appears. Through the whole 7 days of creation, only the name Elokim. Then we zoom in, and we start to have a whole focus on the creation of man in the context of the relationship with God. Now, which name we would use then? Both. Because you start from what you see and deduce there's more, and then you actually try to connect to that which is beyond what you can see. Just like we do with human beings. We start with your face and your voice and your words, and then we realize there's more, and then we're not only relating to what we do see and realize there's more, we're also trying to relate to the thing we don't see that's much deeper inside you. And so all the way through that section, we consistently say Hashem Elokim, Hashem Elokim. B'yom says Hashem Elokim Eretz HaShamayim, the day Hashem God made earth and heaven. Hashem God formed a garden. Hashem God, makes it rain. Hashem God takes man, dust on the ground. Hashem God, Hashem God, Hashem God, all the way through until Ganya.
Is the name representing how we relate to Hashem, or how it relates to us?
More how we relate to Hashem. We might relate to Hashem. You're right. We relate to Hashem as He relates to us. But it's really, that's what we're doing. Okay, that's a very quick answer. You could really say both. Okay, but the point is that we're dealing with both, and that runs all the way consistently through until this pasuk. V'hanochash haya aram, the serpent was more cunning. Let's say mikol chayas hasada, from all the beasts of the field, asher asa Hashem Elokim, that Hashem God had made. So we're still using the word Hashem God. V'yom ela isha, he says to the woman, Afki amar Elokim, did Elokim say you can't eat from the tree? From any tree in the garden. So notice what he does. He changes the name of God. It's a very subtle move. He's essentially saying, can we just talk about God the way you see God? None of this deeper, objective. And But he's also put a question that is false, like, can you eat from no trees of the garden? She said, of course we can eat from trees of the garden, the fruit of the tree of the garden, we can eat from all the fruits of the tree of the garden. Here we go. But from the fruit of the tree that is in the center of the garden, Ama Elokim, she falls for it. She's also talking about God the way we see God. Elokim told us we can't eat from it and touch it lest you die. And the snake basically turns around and says, aha, now that I've got you here to a bit of your subjective self-centeredness, I'm going to show you how far down the rabbit hole this thing goes. And that's what he says next. He says, you know what? You won't die. Ki yodea Elokim, God knows, again he's using that word. Ki b'yom echalchem, the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open. V'yisem ke'Elokim, you can be like that. The way you see God, you can be the same thing. You can be the center of reality. You can determine if it feels good to you, it's good. If it feels bad to you, it's bad. You can be the subjective center of reality. And they fall for the trick and they sin. And now listen to this, what happens next. Vayishmu, and they hear us call the voice of Hashem Elokim coming back into the garden. The two names, God as we see him and God as is beyond, coming into the garden in the spirit of the day. And man can no longer do it. Their eyes have opened, the Pesukim say, which means they now see the world through their own little eyes, subjectively, not objectively. I'm going with the Rambam, but it's a really straightforward reading of this. And they can't deal with God anymore, not the two names of God. And a man and his wife hide, mipnei Hashem Elokim. They're hiding from Hashem God. They can't deal with the two names. And after this story finishes, the two names split. They usually only deal with the name Elokim, occasionally with the other one. They can't deal with them together. And that's occasionally, very occasionally, get a glimpse of it back with the others. But mainly it returns when we're ready as a people to transcend the world of sin and come face to face with God once again. Where am I talking about? When do we stand face to face with God, ready to... Where? Har Sinai. And what was the opening line that God says? Anochi, I am Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God. And now the names are back together again, except that we lose that level at golden calf. Eile Elohecha Yisrael. So you see, and then again the names generally split apart. In the Beis Hamikdash we usually, in the Mishkan we use the name Hashem, outside we use Elokim. Right, depends on the relationship we're having. Until the book of Devarim, and the whole book of Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu is calling us to put those names back. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Listen, is Hashem, is Elokeinu. At our race of Adat, you've been shown to know Hashem Hu Elokim. Hashem is God, right? You should know today and drawn to Hashem Hu Elokim. This is Moshe Rabbeinu's whole speech. Once you realize that this is the narrative, the Nachash splits the names, they come back together, they get split apart again. This is it. Now, that narrative is so straightforward and compelling once you've seen it that I don't think it will be possible to believe these are different authors and fragments and texts that were woven together. That's not what's going on. So that's the sort of thing that you'd want to talk about with that I was talking about on Friday night. That's a small example. We want to really study Bible criticism. You have to really go thoroughly through the arguments. You have to see how it works with the Mabul, an hypothesis there, and then you've got Richard Elliott Friedman as a whole piece on how you can see two authors there. And there's a very powerful piece in Joshua Berman's book where he shows actually it's one big chiasm and there's no possible way it's two authors. It's like a chiasm means you start A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. And he shows just one very long one where everything is like a big reflection. It's a whole, you can actually, by getting to biblical critical stuff, you're ever interested in it, actually, when you really learn it properly, you realize that often the argument that destroys it just shows the real beauty in Torah you didn't see before. Okay, but that was what I was going into on Friday night. The names of Hashem Elokim is actually the essence of the whole narrative of Torah. And once you see it, it's just so compelling, I think, that you couldn't possibly believe that this was an accident of, how in the middle of the Gan Eden story, another text came in at that particular moment that only used the name Elokim, and then that's ridiculous, right? So it's clearly part of the essence of the story. Okay. There were other questions at the beginning, which I've only got about 3 minutes left. What were the other questions that I've missed? I missed two, one or two. What else were there at the beginning?
It's a justification for a man to have the power to not do it.
Oh, okay, so that's an excellent question. So in halacha nowadays, both sides have to approve of a divorce, right? Min Torah, you're right, only a man has to give the get, but that's because the man does the kiddushin. There's a technical, is a man allowed to refuse to give his wife a divorce according to the Torah? No. Absolutely not. It's an issa d'oraisa. You're violating minimally v'avtorecha kamocha, right? Which is a catch-all for klal gadol Torah, right? It's completely forbidden.
No release for her unless she will.
Right. So no. So the reason, so as far as the Torah is concerned, there are scenarios where a man can marry. A man has to initiate the marriage because a man can have more than one wife and a woman can't have more than one husband. So the exclusivity has to work one way. on a deeper level, you'll say it's because for whatever, you'll give other reasons as well, why the man has to initiate with an act of giving, because it's less natural. But the point is the man technically creates the marriage, therefore the man technically has to dissolve it. A man is not allowed to refuse to, and under rabbinic law, at least under Chen and Rabbeinu Gershom, both sides can technically refuse, but neither one should do, but they both have to consent to divorce. Now, that's the reasoning why. Now we can get to the question, why would it be permissible to have more than one wife? I'm going to give a very brief recap of something I spoke about in a previous discussion, only because if somebody's watching this and hasn't seen previous discussions, they could get very perturbed by that. And I explained that I think it's a logical principle, which is that doesn't make sense to us nowadays, but in the ancient world, you often had a mass depopulation of the male population. It happened all the time whenever you had a war, for example. And you would have to have polygamy. I mean, if you didn't have polygamy, women would never get married, never have children, but the population wouldn't repopulate. So the Torah has to allow many institutions, it doesn't like it calls it tsoros, right? It's a strife. But it can't ban it because for large chunks of human history, it was actually a very important social institution. And there are other cases where it could be socially important as well. And then Rabbeinu Gershom looks around and says, we're all in exile nowadays. There's no such thing as an army and a military. And this thing doesn't exist anymore. So now there's no good reason for this. And now it can only be out of bad midas, bad character traits or lust or whatever else. And that's wrong. So therefore, we're not going to allow it anymore. Based on the Torah's internal reasoning, it should be banned. But that's what goes on. But yeah, for the Avos having, so the Avos only usually have, so there's only one of who, well, okay, let's go through each one. Avram has more than one wife at a time only when he can't have a child from his first wife. So the only alternative was to divorce her. And she didn't want to be divorced, so she actually proposed the idea of have some children with another person. Which, given that was a standard practice in the ancient world, that would have not been, she was the initiator of it, and it makes sense. Yaakov was meant to marry Rachel, not Leah, but he got tricked into marrying the older sister. So again, he could divorce her. In most cases in the ancient world, till very recently, a woman really desperately did not want to get divorced. Once she was married to somebody, it was very rare. She could have a divorce, but it was not common. And most of the women would rather be married. In Leah's case, she didn't want to get divorced. Yaakov would have divorced her. The marriage goes through. Luckily for her, she had a child, but she was desperate to have Yaakov's favor. So now he's going to marry Rachel, who originally had the agreement to marry, but he's also been tricked into Leah. So that's how it works. And when they can't have children, they each suggest somebody else. And in the ancient world, you had the principle of surrogacy, and that's exactly the principle they both use. The shifcha, that's exactly, you see it in the Hammurabi Code. It was obviously a well-known practice in the ancient world. But we never see anyone outside of kings in Tanakh who we consider a tzaddik, a righteous person, marrying a second wife, except when there was a problem having children. Hannah and Penina. When you can't have children with one wife, and she doesn't, and they were desperate, that everyone wanted to have children. Nowadays we've got a society that's not so excited about children. But in the ancient world, that was everything. Of course you wanted children. So if you couldn't have a child, you married somebody else. Now, if that either meant divorce, or it meant a second wife. And obviously everyone would consent to it. In all those stories, there's a consent. It's not always a nice scenario to be in. But that's, okay. We're going back to therefore, so therefore the man creates an exclusivity, the woman doesn't create an exclusivity biblically. And that's why the man has to then trigger the technical act of both kiddushin and divorce. There's, again, like I said, there's a deeper aspect as well, which is the essence is the man has to learn to be a giver, and therefore also the act of giving has to be part of kiddushin. That's almost for sure also part of it. Whatever the technical reasons why the man has to do the technical act that introduces it, he has to unravel it. In other words, for us, it's not just a social convention, there's a metaphysical reality, and whatever keys were turned to open have to be unturned to close. But you're allowed to say no to a divorce if you feel there's a hope for the marriage still. So one side might feel there's a hope that they can work it through, that's completely permitted. But once it crosses the point where there's no hope, you're obligated to divorce. That person can fail to fulfill their obligation, and there's techniques that Chazal allowed for forcing up to certain. There has to be some level of consent, but you can apply immense pressure. In a modern liberal state, that's much harder to do, because the norms of a liberal state will generally not work that way, and how you marry the two legal systems creates all sorts of complications for a modern situation. And a lot of work's putting into ensuring agunas don't become agunas, or oguns don't become oguns. Men or women don't get trapped in these marriages. So that's the basic. Was there one more question I didn't touch upon at the beginning? Or have we gone through all of the beginning ones? Okay, then this might be a good place to finish.